and how it affects agriculture. I think in particular, even though we're quite aware of what is going on concerning COVID, we do believe at IoD that there is life after COVID. So it's about time we start positioning our business to see how we can take advantage of the environment. Before we kick off, I would like to invite the president of IoD, Chief Chris Okunowo, to just say some few remarks. Thank you very much.
Chris, I believe if you're speaking, you may be on mute.
I've been muted, but okay, now. Thank you, members of the Governing Council and the Executive Committee members of the Institute of Directors Nigeria, fellows and members of the Institute here, our distinguished panelists and the moderator, our guests, associates and partners, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure on behalf of the Governing Council of the Institute of Directors Nigeria to welcome you to this session or this edition of our webinar series with the theme AfCFTA, how Nigeria can take advantage of the impending continental free zone in Africa and the opportunities that exist for the agricultural sector. I wish to sincerely recognize and welcome our distinguished panelists and moderator, Mr. Emmanuel ljewere, DFIOD, Joint of Past President of the Institute of Directors, and Vice Chairman, Nigerian Agribusiness Group. I also have Mrs. Folusho Olaniyan, OON, FIOD Program Director, Agric, West Africa. Mrs. Lola Masha, who is being represented. She's the Executive Director of Abimbola Agricultural Supply Agency. And Mr. Ayodej Balogun, member of the Institute of Directors, is Chief Executive Officer of Agric Commodity Exchange. And our moderator today is Mrs. Nneka Eze. This team of experts in the agriculture brings to us today decades of experience in finance, in trade, agriculture, governance, and administration, among others. They are highly skilled corporate executives, master business leaders with several years of active experience working in various sectors of the economy. I'm indeed very proud to welcome all of you here today to share experience and contribute meaningfully to the discourse. I also wish to welcome all other eminent personalities, guests, associates, and friends of our great institute to this event. Ladies and gentlemen, the whole world is groaning under the impact of the rapid spread of the coronavirus, COVID-19, which has struck and continues to destabilize the economies of several countries in the world, including Nigeria, with attendant consequences on human, material, and financial losses. As part of measures to continue to operate and realize the mission and vision of the Institute without contravening the lockdown and social distancing guidelines by the government, we have deliberately adopted a platform such as this to continue to provide service and remain relevant for things. It is for this reason that we're having this event on Zoom as opposed to our usual physical meetings. I have no doubt in my mind that the choice of the theme for this event has been carefully made, among other options, in recognition of the treasury issues and conversations arising from the signing and implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Zone Agreement by our country. You will also recall that the AfCFTA was adopted as a central theme at the annual Directors Conference of the Institute held in Abuja on Thursday, 26 September 2019. It is estimated that the implementation of the agreement could increase inter-African trade by 52% by 2022, compared with trade levels in 2010, and double the share of intra-African trade, currently around 30% of African exports, by the start of the next decade. We must therefore encourage wide and deep engagement with all stakeholders, including the business community, governments, and professional organizations, in order that will bring about the desired benefits of the agreement, particularly to the agricultural sector of our dear country. It is for these stated reasons, therefore, that this webinar aims to examine the perceived opportunities and threats across the value chain and the role of the agri-business stakeholders, vis-a-vis producers, professors, marketers in the private sector, and policymakers. It is therefore anticipated that this forum will fully explore and distill the opportunities therein for the benefit of agri-businesses and stakeholders in Nigeria. Our distinguished directors and leaders, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to accordingly encourage all of us to be open-minded and participate actively in this webinar, so as to take advantage of the enormous wealth of experience of our panelists and indeed my moderator. Finally, I wish to express my special gratitude to all the past presidents of our institute, the members of the governing council, and executive committee members for their untiring efforts and commitment to the cause of this institute, even this challenging time of COVID-19 outbreak. I wish to also thank the chairman and members of the Agriculture and Agro-Allied Committee of the institute, as well as the management of the Secretariat for organizing this webinar. I thank you all for your attention and wish you fruitful deliberations. Please continue to keep safe and healthy. God bless you all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction and the context. I believe that was very helpful for all of us to understand the potential, in a way, around the Africa Free Trade Agreement, the Continental Free Trade Agreement. One of the things that we'll do is allow the different panelists to do a mini introduction of themselves. And perhaps I will start. Nneka Eze, I'm a partner at Dahlberg and I lead our work in Nigeria. I also co-lead our global agriculture and food security practice, and I've been working in agriculture in this area for over a decade. I think one of the things that I see as perhaps a vision for Nigeria as we think about this Continental Free Trade Agreement is the potential to drive and really further invest in our competitiveness in a way that supports both smallholder farmers, but also processors in that sort of ability to better serve the region. I think we have that potential given our location, given our agroecology, and I'd like to see that really be unlocked over the coming years. So I would ask each of the panelists to do a similar introduction. So introduce yourself and share your vision really for Nigeria in terms of agriculture in the context of Africa's Continental Free Trade Agreement. We can start perhaps with Folusho, and then we'll go around.
I'm Folusho Olaniyan, Program Director, Agri-Innovate West Africa. It's the largest agricultural trade show in the continent of Africa. And it's a pleasure to be here discussing the Continental Free Trade Agreement. My vision for Nigeria is to become an economy that is dependent on agricultural products that make major trade lines globally and within Africa. To transit from being an economy that is dependent on oil to becoming dependent on agricultural products and for it to be sustainable. I've been in the food industry for 3 decades now, 8 of which has been focused in agriculture. The remaining 2 decades has been in working with SMEs in processing. So I've gone from backward to forward integration across the entire food value chain. And I'm delighted to be here today to discuss the trade zone and the impact it would have on Nigeria's economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ubong?
Good afternoon. My name is Ubong Inyang. I'm very delighted to be here, surrounded by such experienced and great company. I'm here representing Lola Masha, who's the Executive Director of Corporate Services at Babanguna. Babanguna is an agricultural service firm that works with smallholder farmers in Nigeria. And currently the work that we do, we currently are one of the probably the largest aggregator and producer of maize in Nigeria. At Babanguna, I manage partnerships and also corporate communications within the company. So part of my responsibility is to drive strategic partnerships and initiatives that are in line with our objectives to expand our membership base of farmers and basically improve outcomes for our smallholder farmers across Nigeria and in the next few years to come, other African countries where we'd be present as well. Thank you.
Great. Ayodej?
Thanks, Nneka.
Introduce yourself and your vision for Nigerian agriculture in the context of the trade agreement.
Thanks. I'm Ayodej. I'm the CEO of FX Commodities Exchange. Primarily, we unlock liquidity for agricultural, connecting producers, traders with processors, primarily the use of some of these grains for export, for production, but also linking Nigerian commodities to the export market. My vision for Nigeria primarily, for agriculture in Nigeria is to be able to be a lot more competitive, price competitiveness, for Nigeria to be able to feed itself, be food self-sustainable, not just as a country, but with focus on each of the sub-regions, being able to be food self-sufficient. And then we ultimately get to a point where we're competitive enough to export and drive the exports, both for intra-Africa trade, as well as export to the international markets. So underlying theme for me in the context of the Africa Free Trade, Continental Free Trade Agreement is competitiveness. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Emmanuel from NABG. Sorry, I'm just going to unmute you. There you go.
That's right. Thank you very much. First, I thank everybody for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. I fully align myself with the presentation made by the President of the Institute of Directors in his opening remark. I also support what Folusho said and all the other previous speakers. But I want to explain that the kappa I'm wearing here today is that of the Nigeria Agribusiness Group. Incidentally, the Nigeria Agribusiness Group was specifically established by the former Minister of Agriculture, Dr. Adeshina, when he was the minister, because it was discovered that the private sector had no common voice in the agricultural space. As a consequence, government policies were written in government offices for implementation by illiterates. So it was necessary now to get people who can speak out for the agricultural space. So it was established, and the the current president of that body, to which I'm vice president, actually sends his greetings, his Sunny Dangote, and wishes everybody well. Having said that, the experience I have brought into this whole project, it started with the Nigeria Economic Summit Group. I was the pioneer chairman of the Agriculture and Food Security Commission, where we try to build and make some sense out of agriculture and drive home to government the fact that agriculture should be the foundation and the future of Nigeria's economy. This was the situation, and one of the members at that time was Dr. Adeshina. The moment he was made the minister, he now decided to convert that particular committee into a body, a national body called Nigeria Agribusiness Group. That is what we are bringing here. And this is the umbrella body for the entire agricultural space. That is the entire sector, right from the seed providers or the input providers to the farmers, to the logistics people, everybody right down the line. And we were very much involved in the discussion that led to the African Continental Free Trade negotiations. But now we are at a crossroad, and I think those are the things I'll be talking about later, because I'm also a member of the National Action Committee. Nigeria has signed the first leg, but that first leg is not very satisfactory to everybody, and therefore the federal government has set up the body, which is the Action Committee, to advise on how to negotiate the second leg. And that's where the kind of areas I want us to discuss and see how Nigeria can benefit most tremendously from this. The other thing I want to say, whoever the listeners are, because I understand that I can see that almost 100 people have hooked in on this. So I will want to specifically say, if you have taken the trouble to hook in on this, you must ask yourself, how do I benefit from it? Because all those who are on this platform now have the privilege of being educated, of being the IT savvy, of being able to understand what's happening in the world. While over 90% of those in this agricultural space don't have this opportunity, don't have this exposure. Therefore, for taking the trouble to be on board, you must take the responsibility of moving Nigeria forward agriculturally. We have always prayed, unfortunately, that oil price should collapse. God has collapsed the oil price for us. But we did not pray for COVID. But if COVID has done it for us, that's about the only good little thing COVID has done, and give Nigeria an opportunity to retool, to reset. And therefore, the discussion today is about how do we reset and take advantage of this new paradigm, this paradigm we are now having to face. That's my thinking, my innovation, my focus on this. I'm sorry for speaking for too long. I apologize. Thank you.
No worries. Thankfully, we do have a bit of time, and I think it's helpful to have the context of where your organization is coming from and then that vision that you see. But I think what we heard across the responses in terms of that vision for Nigerian agriculture really starts with this question about productivity and factor productivity, both on the farm and then across the value chain as we think about some of the different constraints that exist. And then I think the other one which you started to highlight, Emmanuel, is really around this need for collaboration and some amount of conversation, advocacy from a policy perspective. So I think it's very helpful just to get some of that history and the context. I know there's a few questions about how best to make this interactive. I think with 120 plus attendees, it will be tough to do sort of allow a number of people to speak, but we will start to address a number of the questions that are typed into the Q&A towards the end of the session. What we're going to focus on first is what does this mean for Nigeria and for Nigerian businesses in terms of the actual Continental Free Trade Agreement. And then we're going to talk a little bit about next steps. So really, what would this mean if we are to ratify the trade agreement? What would it look like for Nigeria? What actions specifically do we need to make sure that we see benefits from the trade agreement? And then, yes, we will plan to have some Q&A. I want to start though to provide a little bit more context. I know Chris had provided a bit of introduction around really what is Africa's Continental Free Trade Agreement. Ayodej, can you provide a bit of context for the audience? Just tell us a little bit more about the trade agreement and what you see as the potential benefits for agriculture.
Thank you, Nneka. So in principle, the Continental Free Trade Agreement makes Africa an economic bloc, means that we would have very similar trade terms, and then it means that to international buyers, all agricultural products. And, you know, so I like when I look at so two opportunities. One is what is the intra-Africa trade flows going to look like? How will member countries be able to trade with themselves, and what product form will those trades happen? On the other side, it will also look at what can Africa trade with the rest of the world, and how can that be a lot more competitive. So I like to dimension it along these two lines. Then if you look at it from an agricultural standpoint and where Nigeria sits. So fundamentally, we have a comparative advantage when you look at it from a point of available land size, being proximity to the ports, the number of crop varieties we have, the volume of those crops that we produce, and then sort of the advancement of both our financial markets and our level of industrialization, because all of those things support our capacity to create value and then appropriate value as such. So we then need to then drill down and say, how are we performing along those lines? What areas do we need what areas do we need to fix to ensure that we are a lot more competitive, and that those demands do not go to other countries around us. We also need to dimension it around the risk lines, and then say, what are the palliatives that needs to be in place? How are we better prepared? What are the risk of dumping, cross-border trades, and how will that affect? And we need to look at it from I like to look at it from three angles. So what's the political stance that we want to take? What is the economic implication? And how does that affect our exchange rates, for instance? Understanding that our neighboring countries have a fixed exchange rate agreements with the euro, and we have a very fast declining monetary stance. So how will all of this affect us from an economic standpoint? And then we get into the job creation dimension. So as a country that is growing by about 3 billion people every year, we need to think of it to say, is this going to create more jobs, and how do we dimension to ensure that even though we're getting more trade and more business, it's actually one that is actually creating more prosperity across the country. So those would be sort of my dimensions. And then as we go into things, we can look at scenario analysis and implications.
Yeah, I guess one of the things maybe to highlight, and I think in terms of thinking about the different areas that we think about in terms of the free trade agreement, I think one that's important to keep in mind is that Nigeria is not yet a signatory to the free trade agreement, and so all of this conversation is really in context of what might it take in a way, should we participate, and what does that participation really look like? But a number of our neighboring countries and countries across the continent have signed the free trade agreement, and I think it's a question about what might that path look like if we are planning to sign it. I think there's been quite a bit of analysis around this in terms of some of the why perhaps we weren't able to sign, but it is a question about what is it going to take, and hopefully that's one of the things that we'll be looking at during this discussion as well. So Deji, thank you very much for that breakdown in terms of the concerns or issues we need to really think about, but then also how we might be able to think about benefiting from the free trade agreement. I'll go over to Ubong from Babangona. I think one of the things we've looked at is really an ambitious goal for Babangona to reach 1 million farmers in the next few years in Nigeria. I'm wondering, as you think about Continental Free Trade Agreement, how is it going to, or how could it impact your social enterprise? How could it impact the farmers that you work with? Is it something that you're already, considering as you think about your business and your operations?
Right, Nneka, thank you very much for the question. So I think I'll start from the point where looking at what we do currently as an organization, which is working with smallholder farmers. When you talk about agriculture, which is pretty much dominated by crop production in Nigeria, one of the key constraints at the very early stages is always been the ability of farmers to have access to good, high quality inputs, right? I think for us, working over time, we've been able to improve outcomes for our farmers. And for us, it's also part of our plans, not only to increase our reach in Nigeria to 1 million farmers, as you rightly said, but we also do have the intention to replicate our model, which has been successful in other African countries. Now, when you look at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, one of the key things there is around the free movement of people and goods. And you'd imagine that for an organization seeking to replicate similar models across boundaries, it is important that we're able to have access to these other markets, have access in terms of being able to make the right connections there with regulatory bodies, with stakeholders in local communities, and the likes. But more so, you look at the benefits to the smallholder farmers in the sense that if we are really driven by this single passport system, you do have a market that is at a larger scale, and this now creates new opportunities around commodity-based industrialization, right? And if we're able, for us, while we haven't really knocked out any concrete plans of moving further along the value chain, right? I do believe that there is a lot of opportunity there with the AfCFTA for players who would be willing to invest in processing, especially when you talk around commodity-driven industrialization, which is usually labor-intensive. And so it would be an opportunity for people to come up with innovative business models that would include smallholder farmers in their computations and how they source their products, allowing farmers to even benefit from higher margins in production.
Great, thank you very much. I think one thing to note is, of course, this ambition to go beyond Nigeria and think about your business beyond the borders. And of course, that means the agreement would affect that business even more. But also really thinking about how you can ensure that the farmers that you're working with are really competitive in terms of taking advantage of some of the potential benefits around the free trade agreement. So thank you for the reflections. We'll go to Emmanuel from NABG next. I think one of the things that we want to better understand is really where can Nigeria stand out? So we know that there's been, historical global dominance of Nigeria in a number of value chains. We know that Nigeria has enormous agricultural potential. It's been discussed in many different fora. What does that mean now if we think about the comparative advantage that Nigeria might have in agriculture as we compare it to other markets in Africa? Where can Nigeria really currently stand out apart from other markets?
My reaction to it will be in bullet points. First, where is Nigeria today? Nigeria is a country damaged by oil, which meant that its best brains moved into the fast industry like oil banking and so on, while the agricultural base that should have been the foundation of Nigeria's economy was abandoned to people who did not have that advantage. So that's a minus for us. But the rest of Africa, only few countries, not more than 5 of them, can be said can give Nigeria a run for its money. But they don't have a big thing that we have, which is called markets. Something else they do not have is the level of well-educated people who have gone into other fields but can easily come back here. So the next thing is we now need to start the journey of well-educated people coming back into the agricultural space. The foundation of any successful agricultural value chain is relying on a demand-based development. That means that those who want the goods are the ones that will determine what needs to be done. The moment you create that, you start creating a line of communication between those who want it, who have access to market, and those who are producing. Now you make your demand to those who are producing. When you're able to do that, you now create a situation where, first, the commitment of the off-taker rubs off on the poor farmer in terms of giving him the right seed to be able to meet his demand. Number two, the experience of the off-taker also creates a better value chain and logistics system that reduces the post-harvest losses. As of today, the statistics is simple. The Nigerian farmers produce 135% of the food we need to eat in Nigeria without importing anything. But over 60% of that food never gets to our table or to our kitchens to be cooked because of that loss. This is where I'm saying all those who are listening and being part of this, we are all going to work together to deal with that. Those people who don't have the privilege of listening to us and exposed the way we're exposed cannot go beyond where they are. And many of them are in their 50s and 60s. We need to work our way back to them. Having said that, to answer your question, once we're able to start doing that, the rest of Africa will be a no-show. The only countries that today can give us a run for our money are South Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and in a very little way, Ghana. Beyond that, Nigerians are capable of really moving and taking the center stage. But for it to be done, there must be this bridge that must be built between those people out there. So the first thing I want to urge everybody is, first of all, spend energy thinking of how can I add value to what these farmers are doing? How can I add value? That's what I'm saying, that this discussion is not about talking in the air. Let's talk to the people we are dealing with. For you to have come in, you are interested in the agricultural space. And I'm advising them, don't waste all of you cannot be good farmers. So don't bother. And it's a very, very tedious thing. See how you can now stop these post-harvest losses by adding value, buying from them, creating a way of moving the goods from them and getting it to the market and adding a little value. Nigeria is losing so much today in terms of losses as well as exporting raw goods. I take a simple thing like cashew. Cashew today is sold in the shop, processed cashew is sold in the shop in Paris for an equivalent of, in Naira terms, of 150 Naira. The farmer sold it for only 2 Naira. That the French people don't. So they sold it to the Vietnamese, who sold it, who now processed it and sent it to France. These are practical things we have traced right through, and we worked with them with the French embassy. So these are the challenges that anybody that is listening to this, ask yourself, can't you go into this? Nothing is complicated. I'm just simply saying, this is not a lecture. This is a doing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's really helpful context. I think one of the sort of advantages you mentioned in a way is the scale in terms of our agricultural lands. Obviously, there are some concerns around yields, but really this question about post-harvest losses is very important as we think about our ability to maintain competitiveness with other countries if we are going to move forward with the trade agreement. So thank you for those reflections and reflections on where we have some pluses in terms of comparative advantages and where we have some potential disadvantages that need to be addressed. we'll go next, and I do see there's a number of questions in the chat. So if you don't mind using the Q&A, it just will help us better capture the questions. Some of the questions are very specific to value chains, which I don't know that we'll get into necessarily during the discussion, but the panelists and I will try and answer as best we can the questions. And I think Institute of Directors and the other participants will help to direct us as well. We'll now go to Folusho. You mentioned your work with SMEs, and you've worked with hundreds, I believe, of small and medium businesses across Nigeria. You've also run a very large consumer-facing business previously, so I've seen sort of different sizes of business. Would like you to reflect on the free trade agreement, particularly if there are specific opportunities that you're seeing in agricultural value chains for Nigerian businesses. Emmanuel mentioned this question about how do you reduce post-harvest losses, whether that's in storage or in transportation, but would love to hear additional reflections you have, whether those are specific to value chains or specific to segments of the value chain.
For me, I see the way forward for Nigeria is investing in agricultural research and innovation systems. Because with research, you can actually find out different ways of doing things to save money, cut costs, come up with more yielding species, and better processing practices. Innovation systems will put to rest the worry about post-harvest losses, because if the country is able to come up with different solutions to reduce losses, then it's possible to have enough to export. So research is key, and innovation is also very key. Another thing I feel we should look at is the way to reorientate our people. You know, what I've realized is that colonialism has done a lot of damage, in the sense that the trading then was between the colonial masters and the countries within their colony. And because of that, there hasn't been much trading intra-Africa. You find out sometimes that most of our best produce, the best of our harvest, goes straight either to Europe or to the Americas. Whereas those goods can be sold, the produce can be sold better even within Africa. So like I said, colonialism is responsible for that. And this agreement that we see is something that can make trading better within Africa. Farmers can earn more money, because you realize that, like Mr. ljewere said, you buy cashews here for 2 naira, you sell them in France for 150. Whereas the same cashews can be sold here for 20 naira and sold for 40 naira in another African country. But the mentality of, you know, you haven't made it until your goods get to the UK and the US are some of the things that make our farmers fall victim of the exploitation by, you know, those who come to buy this produce from them in large quantity. And I strongly believe,
what does that mean for, in a way, specific opportunities where you think there's potential in the context of the free trade agreement?
There's potential, for example, in processing and packaging, because it's easier for you to process your produce partly here and then, you know, send out to another African country for them to use in another production process. For example, you can process cassava into cassava cake, and you preserve it longer and then sell it to another country that will use it to produce other goods. So for Nigeria, especially periods where there is a glut, and that happens quite often for some crops, you now have the opportunity to process partly and then sell to neighboring African countries that are in need of that product as a raw material. And you don't necessarily have to sell it at a loss. In fact, you could sell at a premium if you've pre-processed before sending out to the other countries. And then the low-hanging fruits in this agreement, for me, are when you look at the border towns around Nigeria and the demand, what they demand for in terms of products, and some of them want fresh produce, you realize that because there are these restrictions, there are border rules, there are tariffs, people don't even want to test new products. They don't want the problems at the border. But when the border becomes open, there are opportunities for new products to find their way across. About 48% of traded goods now are manufactured. And when this agreement comes into place fully, that means there's room for more manufactured goods to go across. And it's in manufacturing you create jobs. So if Nigeria is able to improve its manufacturing base, more jobs will be created, more goods can be sold within Africa, and the more you produce, the opportunity to benefit from economies of scale, and profitability may improve in the long run.
Great, thank you very much for the reflections, I think, and where you're seeing some of those challenges and opportunities.
Nneka, just to follow up on what she just said, just one short sentence to our viewers. I want to say to this, all those who are viewing today, just go to the nearest market. Of course, you might have to put on your mask. Go to your local market, see what they sell, see the people selling. Ask yourself, can this be improved upon? Can value be added to this? Can this be better preserved? That's where we should start from. The problem we have is not abstract. It's there in our front. Let them just go to the local market or go to the local shop and see how these people are done. Sorry, thanks very much for indulging me.
Thank you for that intervention. I'll move over now to Ayodej to provide as well some reflections. Folusho has introduced a few different opportunity areas, particularly around processing and packaging, particularly if we think about some of the quality investments. Would love to hear your reflections on how businesses can really take advantage more concretely of some of these opportunities. And then we'll love to hear your reflections on AfCFTA's positioning in terms of the Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Thank you, Nneka. Great. Folusho raised very great points, and I think that's really where we need to be able to drive economic growth and create dignified jobs, like I like to call them. Being able to take food from commodities, so from seeds and inputs into commodities, and then moving from commodities into consumer goods. And that's where you really have value addition, create a lot of meaningful jobs, but also, build ecosystems around these commodities and that journey. Now, if you look at manufacturing and you look at the trends and look at the GDP contribution, it's not been great, very impressive. And, undoubtedly so, certainly we operate in a very low infrastructure climate, which increases the cost of doing business extremely high. Power, for one, is a must fix if we really want to build a competitive economy. The other part of it is that it's cheaper to move grains from Argentina through the whole Black Sea and land it in the ports here than for us to be able to move it from Kaduna to Lagos. So it is just, it's unheard for, so we need to find ways to be able to crash down cost of logistics. So cost of logistics for raw materials contributes about 12 to 15% of raw material cost to processing companies. This is just sheer inefficiency and could be, dropped to somewhere between 3 to 4 which is sort of like best practice. The other part of where we also need to look at around these things is our ports. It will be very difficult for us to do business with the world if the average turnaround time through the Nigerian ports is about 13 weeks. It's just great, and it's been like that for about 24 to 30 months.
And did you, just to clarify, are these specific opportunities that you see for, whether that's for individuals, investors, or businesses in agricultural value chains that they can address? That's more the question. How can businesses really take advantage of some of these opportunities that Folusho shared, particularly around processing, packaging, et cetera?
So if you look at the so demand works in our favor. So if you look at the diet patterns and the growing middle class, so we're seeing increased uptake of consumer goods. So soap, for instance, has grown quite significantly across all the ranges, and that's primarily from palm oil. So along from taking it from the crude palm all the way to the finished tablet soap, has a lot of opportunities that you could look at. If you look at the food sector, rice is growing. The demand is still very, very significant, and you could come in from a cottage to a very large-scale meal, depending on the size of investment. It's also a crop that grows, that is consumed across the country. So there are quite a bit of opportunities there. The protein value chain is another one. So in the last sort of about 10 years, the poultry sector grew in Nigeria by about 600% over a 10-year period. So that's sort of one fast-growing sector, and then it also gives opportunity to be able to come in from a low investment to a very high intensive investment where you have the packaging and the finishing products. Snacks, fast foods is another one that has done very well, and then you could take it from maize, mixed cereals to the finished products. You could also look at substituting some imported products like wheat, with other local brands. And then you have, I think with these whole health issues, there's going to be an increased demand for high nutrient snacks, high nutrient foods. And this also gives room for people to come in, either from an SME angle or even larger industries.
I'll follow up. Yes, thank you. I'll follow up on that for a question for both you and Ubong as well from Babanguna. We're getting a lot of questions from the Q&A as well as from the chat just around how people can really get involved. So there's one question about what are the opportunities in trade, and then how can farmers learn different techniques. There's another one about opportunities for local farmers in villages, whether that's around financing or otherwise. Anything that comes to mind as you think about trade and in terms of farming, what opportunities are you really seeing in the market for people to explore? And I'll start with you, Deji, so you continue, and then Ubong, you can chime in as well.
Okay, so one is when you look at primary production, so the cluster model sort of makes it work for both the financer as well as the individual farmers themselves. So we always encourage locations that we work with to organize into clusters. We support the formation of cooperatives, improve the team dynamics within the cooperatives, and then help with financial inclusion where it doesn't exist, and that allows them to be able to access credit. So, for instance, we started our input program, in Kaduna, Katsina, and a few other states, and we're on track for about 50,000 farmers. We're also financing farmers in Ondo, in the cocoa value chain. But it's easy to work with it when the farmers are in clusters, and there's crops that have good markets, industrialized crop, like I like to call them, crops where the buyers and users are industries. So it's easy to work in those value chains because you can organize the market side and you work backwards. But also besides primary production itself, you go look at things around mechanization, being able to provide tractor as a service, being able to provide education to farmer groups, being able to trade either the raw commodities out or be able to sell input packs. So there are quite a number of ancillary businesses around production itself that we could also, people could also consider besides just production.
Great, thank you. I think a number of areas that you mentioned for people to really think about as they're endeavoring into agriculture. Ubong, any reflections as well? We are getting quite a lot of requests for ideas on how people can really get involved, whether that's in farming or in trading, specific opportunities that you're seeing. And for both of you, this could also include within your own businesses as well.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So I think the truth about it is it's always good to understand what the problems are, the problems that a lot of, well, we work with smallholder farmers, so I'm going to just tailor my responses along those lines. So it's just a thing of understanding what are the challenges a smallholder farmer has. And then when you're able to identify those, you now think of, okay, so what are the solutions that can be proffered in that respect? Right. So one of the key areas smallholder farmers tend to have, I like Deju's response, you know, he already did mention, which is a very vital component of how, even for us as an organization, is how our business is structured, is because we also work with farmers in clusters, right? And so I guess one of the things we've been able to do over time is we've been able to aggregate farmers in small clusters, but across very large communities over time. And that way it helps you to manage risks better and all of that. But back to the issue of the smallholder farmer and how a third-party individual can take advantage and make reasonable investments in that space. First would be access to finance, right? Because a lot of times to purchase good quality inputs, the farmers do need access to money at reasonable cost, right? And so I think one way would be looking at organizations that do work directly with smallholder farmers, right, and to invest in those farming schemes. I mean, you'd want to do your due diligence anyways before you choose the organization that you want to work with. But that would be one way without having to get your feet dirty by having to go on the farm and actually working directly. Another thing would be looking at innovative solutions that can help with Mr. ljewere already mentioned the issue of waste, you know, based on production from farms, a lot of things being wasted. We do have a lot of challenges along the value chain with respect to storage, with respect to processing as well. And one of the things I did mention earlier on was agriculture in Nigeria presents an opportunity, particularly looking at the Continental Free Trade Agreement. It does present an opportunity to develop labor-intensive industries. And a lot of these industries will be commodity-driven industries, right? And so we're not really talking about like heavy-duty production lines, right? But some form of value addition that can be done with a lot of manpower and basically taking on the resources that we're able to get from our farmers. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space, and it's something that is not really being explored right now. And it's just a thing of when you know, I remember the story of Real Fruits, and currently they're the largest fruit processing company, dry fruit processing company in Nigeria. That was an opportunity that was not previously explored, right? But now you see there's a company out there doing it, and they're doing really well. And so I believe that there are all these buckets in different sectors along the value chain for different crop products, and for anyone willing or interested in taking the dive into the agricultural sector, it's really to identify one of the spaces that you want to work in and do your research, because beyond crop production, there are vast areas where a lot of investment is needed in agriculture in Nigeria.
Great, thank you, Ubong. And I think one of the big questions is, how do you develop these businesses in a way that is competitive, particularly as we're talking about this context of the free trade agreement? I think Emmanuel would like to come back to you to talk a bit about, perhaps, I don't know if this is controversial or non-controversial, but we haven't ratified the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Should we? And if so, is NABG working, whether that's with private and public sector actors or others, towards the ratification?
Thank you very much. The situation is that Nigeria on the 7th of July last year signed the initial stage of the agreement. Now the second stage is the implementation stage. For you to be part of it, that implementation stage is important. And given the Nigerian constitution, it cannot be a presidential fiat. There must be an act of parliament. So documents are now being prepared for the National Assembly. Now it becomes an open debate before the National Assembly can pass a law. That's basically the situation right now. As it has developed, more and more Nigerians who were opposed to the entire idea are getting back to saying, yes, we can compete in Africa, but these must be taken care of. The fear we had originally was the fact that we are the largest market in Africa, and we have one of the fastest growing middle class. But we have again to our favor some of the world's largest population of young people with young ideas. Put Nigerian youths with African youths, I assure you, they will find their way to get to the top. Now, having said that, I quickly must give an idea of some statistics. We're talking about food preservation. One of the best ways of preserving food is creating a cool environment and refrigeration and so on. The statistics is this, very short. The country with the largest size of cubic meter of refrigerated space in the world is India. Believe it or not, India, 136 million cubic meters. The next one is the United States of America, which is 102. China is 105, yes, about just a little under 100. Now, let's come back to Africa. South Africa has the largest, but even South Africa is only 18 million cubic meters. In Egypt is the next one with 9 million. Nigeria has less than 300,000. That is one of the reasons why we waste so much food, because we've not had people who have taken food preservation seriously. Ghana has 480. 480. So this is an opportunity for us to look at. The other thing I would say is that the world has so developed that Nigerians can take advantage of it. What's happened? Go on YouTube. Any idea you have, go on YouTube. You will discover that there are very many ways you can improve on it. I'm into meat processing. I have a farm in Ekpe. I have greenhouses. I have farmers in Gombe, in Zambuk. I have farmers in Katia. So I work with all these people, and I've seen the whole gamut of opportunities we have. They are big, they are huge, and they are waiting. But if you want to go into agriculture, agro business, the first thing you should think about is not money. First, think of what you want to do, you have love for, the passion for. The next stage is to come up with a concept note. Once you come with a concept note, the third stage and final stage will be the business plan. Take a good business plan anywhere, funding is virtually guaranteed. But the moment you start thinking first about money, you will go nowhere. In Nigeria Agribusiness Group, if you've got to that stage of thinking the idea, preparing your concept notes, and prepare your business plan, get in touch with Nigeria Agribusiness Group. We will get you the right place for the funding. But it must come from you, and you must have the passion. The opportunities are big, they are great, they are humongous. Now, I just gave this one too about the refrigeration opportunities. Go to a market where you see they waste a lot of food. Work with the local government, build a cold room for them, you collect rent on it. There's a lot of money to be made in agriculture, but it's not just only farming. Of course, farming is important.
Thank you for the reflections. I think particularly there's been a lot of questions around how people can get involved in agriculture and really take advantage of some of these opportunities we've been speaking about. As we look forward to the Africa Free Trade Agreement, should we ratify it as a country?
Yes, certainly we should ratify it because we are capable of holding our own anywhere. And the fear that they will be turned Nigeria to a dumping ground, it will be worked out in the negotiation at this next stage. So Nigeria will determine what comes into Nigeria. But the African countries cannot determine for us the honesty of our customs. So we need to do that ourselves. And once we're taking the policy that this kind of thing cannot come into Nigeria, the customs will be carried along to ensure that they do what is best for our country.
Great. And is NABG engaging private and public sector actors towards the ratification of the free trade agreement? Are there specific steps that need to be taken to get to that ratification?
Actual fact, we are holding meetings with Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, NASIMA, the Lagos Chamber, Nigeria Economic Summit Group, and NECA. We are holding a meeting together to come together with a body that will speak for the private sector, and collectively we shall engage with government and make these specific demands that will make it possible for the private sector to benefit from this Africa trade zone.
Great, thank you very much. I think there will be quite a bit of interest to engage with NABG on those discussions, as well as to see how to support that conversation and the ratification going forward. I'll move it back to the panelists, and then we'll try and pick a few more of the questions, many of which are coming through the Q&A. So thank you for the active engagement from the audience. I think there's a question really about what are the specific actions that we need to take as a country to make sure we see the benefits from the Continental Free Trade Agreement rather than the potential challenges, and a number of which have been, concerns that Emmanuel has laid out, whether that's the impact on SMEs, questions about job losses or poor working conditions. But what are the specific actions that we need to take as a country to make sure we see the benefits from the free trade agreement? We'll go to Folusho to hear your perspectives first, and then we'll go round to the other panelists.
I mentioned it earlier when I spoke that investment in agricultural research and innovation systems will help the country stay well positioned to get all the benefits from the agreement. Because once we have different ways and innovative ways of approaching agriculture, then we can have the benefits of economies of scope. Something I raised that I'm going to go back to was that you can part process. And if there are aspects of your production that are extremely expensive or are labor intensive, you can actually outsource that or look at the options of contract manufacturing. So this, for me, I think is the time to look inwards at our process flows in manufacturing and to find out at which points are the costs of production highest, why is this happening, and what can we benefit from knowledge transfer during this new era that we're about to witness. Because I've realized that apart from just goods, there's a lot of knowledge that can be transferred. There are lots of practices that lead to different results. You have products that you manufacture locally using your standard recipes for production. Whereas Ghana, for example, produces their own goods a different way. The way Gari is manufactured in Nigeria is slightly different from how it's done there. And if you find out that the Gari they are selling there is slightly cheaper than what we sell here, then we get into research to find out how we can be competitive so that we can, have a gain in that market. The population of Africa is huge. So if we're going to have one market, then that means there are more opportunities to meet the demands of more consumers. There are more opportunities for diversity in product demands, because you find out that people now have different needs. And if this agreement is put in place, it liberalizes trade, and then everybody can actually have what they want, best of everything from the different countries, painlessly. So I believe again that we should look closely into our manufacturing practices here, find out the ones that need to be adjusted, and to find out how we can be competitive when that time comes. Something else that is a huge opportunity is artificial intelligence. Because when you start trading beyond your regular scope, you want to know what's happening, you want to track your activities. And the best way to do that is through artificial intelligence. And I think there's more room for people to play in that space. Things are going to be done differently. We're going to monitor farms, production, output, and demand. Everything should be able to come into one application. So I think this is a challenge to IT experts to see how they can also come up with applications that can monitor the entire chain from production up to retailing.
Great, thank you very much for that. I think we'll go to Ayodej. What are those specific actions you think we need to take in Nigeria to really take advantage of the benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement rather than to sort of sit more on the side of the challenges? It's possible you're on mute. I'm going to try to unmute you. Okay.
Yeah, I'm struggling for a bit. So first, generally, we need to increase our competitiveness generally. And it starts from increasing the yields at production level, improving logistics, which is a major cost drain, improving the port operations, but also then focus on investing in value addition so that we can. One of the challenges with intra-Africa trade is that we have similarities in natural endowments, so we grow similar products. So when we're able to increase the value addition and convert it into more consumer goods, then there are higher chances of being able to trade with other member countries. I think that's going to be one trajectory that we need to definitely look at. Secondly, we have to look at structures that can unlock long-term funding for agriculture. So financing for agriculture is extremely low, but also extremely short-term. So almost all the loans that are available are all working capital, with the exemption of CAX, which is a very small funding facility. You almost don't have any long-term financing mechanism. Then you have a few private equity players or funds that are focused on agriculture, but in the grand scheme of looking at the contribution of agriculture to the economy, and then the ability to industrialize, to be able to really drive export and trade with other African countries and the other parts of the world, we need to unlock and open up new instruments that will provide long-term financing for those kind of development. I think the third, the last sort of that I will nudge as a quick win is something that we've actually been working on for quite a bit as a country, which is the staple economic processing zones that will build up economic clusters that could actually drive competitiveness and reduce cost of doing business, using the normal cluster economic theory. So I think there's a renewed effort put by the African Development Bank and the Ministry of Agriculture to releasing that, you know, developing staple processing zones. And I think it's going to be, I mean, a good short to medium-term target that as a country we can all rally around, both from the public and private sector, to drive competitiveness.
Great, thank you. I think you've highlighted on a range of issues, particularly I'd say around this financing one, but essentially is our current financial structures and the way we think about policy really in line with what we need to drive agricultural development, and how can we really develop those financial tools that will help for some of the longer term investing that's needed. And then of course, questions across the value chain around, we have a number of investments to make is really what I'm hearing. Ubong, any final reflections, or Emmanuel, particularly around really what is needed in terms of making sure we see the benefits from the free trade agreement?
Okay, so I mean, looking at things for Nigeria as a country, right? I think they already did a good job of highlighting some of these key issues here. You need to talk about the need for infrastructure. You need to talk about the need for improving standards and quality, which is something that is not often taken very serious in Nigeria. But you do find that a lot of the commodities that our farmers do produce, you find that when you take them outside the country, they don't meet those quality standards that will allow these products to be admitted in the international market. So a lot of work needs to be done around training and educating the farmers, whether this is going to be done through the government or through NGOs or through I mean, enterprises such like Bawangona. The point is that our farmers do need to produce at a certain scale and at a certain quality for these goods, whether it's going to be exported next door to Ghana or it's going to be sent across the ocean to Europe or America. It's important. I think another important thing there would be locally. That is, as a country in Nigeria, we need to set standards, and not just in Nigeria, but across the continent, we need to develop and agree to some sort of single passport system that will be applicable across boards in terms of the quality standards and the market rights to access the markets, right? So it becomes less of a hassle. You know that if you want to sell maize in Nigeria, this is the requirement, and the same thing applies across board, maybe in the West African bloc, for instance. So I mean, I think when we talk about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, generally speaking, I think it's a very novel concept, and it's the right direction for not only Nigeria, but also for other African countries, right? But a lot still needs to be done for us to really achieve any form of meaningful progress.
Great, thank you. We have a little bit of time for a few more questions and reflections. So one that has come up in the Q&A, I think could be quite interesting, is, really around technology and how technology can play a role. I will say we haven't necessarily fully addressed this question around, some of the foundational challenges if we think about manufacturing and things like electricity and the importance of reducing our unit cost of production. But on the flip side, technology has been seen in many other markets to really help with leapfrogging a bit in terms of increasing competitiveness and the sharing of information, which is so important for markets to work effectively. Would like to hear reflections from the panel around, technology and how we might be able to use technology around data collection in particular. And is there a way to really ensure that data that's being collected is accurate and perhaps even available so that people can help to resolve some of these challenges that we've mentioned during this session. Perhaps I'll go first to Folusho, and then we can come back to Emmanuel, and particularly would like to hear from Deji and Ubong's direct experience using technology in their operations.
Data is key, and as far as power is concerned, the costs that manufacturing organizations incur, almost 35% of it is power related. But it differs because the different processes they differ according to the different sectors of the manufacturing industry. But it would be interesting to get data, and this will not be difficult because with technology, it's easy to track the energy that is consumed at different aspects of production. So maybe one thing is to carry out a survey and find out what aspects of production consume more energy, and how this can be worked around such that it doesn't have a very negative impact on the bottom line of the organization. Another thing that data would do is for us to actually find out what people really want. Because what we've seen happen in consumer markets sometimes is that people get substitutes if they don't get what they really want. And people don't mind paying slightly higher, the middle class, if they actually feel that they get better value from a different product. So we need to use customer surveys to actually track why people require certain consumer goods, and the difference they are willing to pay if they get better value for their money in terms of maybe the usage, the reusage, and how many variants exist for them to choose from in terms of variety. Data is also key, because if we have updated data on demography, it will guide us on product planning and new product development. And all these are key to play well and play smart in the new trade agreement. So data is very important. Sometimes, most times, companies want to track their losses. When Mr. Ljewere spoke, he said a lot of products really get, there's a lot of post-harvest losses. As much as there are post-harvest losses, there are also losses in production and processing. These are things I think need to be tracked with technology so that, research can be done to find out exactly how to fill those gaps, so that by the time the big market is here, because those gaps are the things that make the prices of our goods high and uncompetitive. And if we are not competitive and we go into this agreement, what will happen is that those who are producing in a competitive environment in other countries will bring in their goods, which will be cheaper than what we are producing here locally. So this is the time to do an audit of our production systems, an audit of our manufacturing, and even the backward integration to find out where costs can be reduced. Power-related costs, people-related costs, and process-related costs. So we need to do an audit so that we know what adjustments to make us competitive before we go out.
And thank you very much for the reflections. Perhaps we'll go to Ubong and to Deji on the technology question. What's the role for technology in terms of getting Nigeria ready for participating in the free trade agreement? And, particularly something that came up in the Q&A is around what are the gaps that technology can help to fill, and then what's the use for data from production to sort of the market side. Ubong, can we go to you for reflections from Babangona's experience?
Okay, thank you for that question. So one of the things that we've realized as an organization is that technology does indeed play a key role. And in fact, you can't successfully scale the impact of what you're doing if you do not adapt your processes with technology, as it were. And so for us, it's been one of the key things that has been driving our business model. And we've been able to digitize 100% of our farm operations, right? So all our on-field operations, we've been able to digitize, and that has really helped us in terms of our ability to capture data on the farm, either from our farmers, their field, their crops, or in terms of distributing inputs across board. You know, we've been able to digitize those processes. Now, if you now talk about looking at it in terms of how Nigeria as a country needs to upskill its technology capabilities to be able, DG has repeatedly mentioned the issue of competitiveness, right? And I think it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation, because on the one hand, one of the key barriers to technology, as it were, is literacy, and literacy levels in Nigeria is low and very low amongst rural farmers. So it's about how do we close that literacy gap first, and I would say in that regard, that's more of a government side responsibility. But on the other hand, it's about also creating simple low-tech solutions that our smallholder farmers can easily adopt in their practices, because it's not about, I don't think the average farmer can afford like a smartphone with all the super functionalities in it, but he can definitely have a phone that has an SMS enabled service, you know. So when thinking about technological solutions, it's essential. Let's establish that it's essential. But for those who would be interested in exploring opportunities to solve problems, I think my key advice would be look at the constraints that surround the environment in which you're going into, and look at how you can provide solutions that are suitable and adaptable to those circumstances. I think for me, yes, I think that's it. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much for the reflections. And perhaps Deji, any reflections there? I think one question that came up was around accuracy of data. And I think in that, perhaps some question about collaboration as well. So any reflections on how data and potentially data and collaboration can support with competitiveness questions?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we can very easily correlate data availability, financial inclusion, and productivity. So if we're able to track transaction data for farmers over a year, for instance, we've built an app that could sort of start to build their credit history based on the number of times they produce, when they take a loan, when they repay it, their forms of transactions, the quantity of grains they saved, which also show their saving patterns and some of those transactional behaviors, the group dynamics, the number of times they meet, and we're able to predict their credit rating, and that enables them access financing. The other part of it is also to be able to understand, you know, what are market dynamics, what are areas of glut, what are areas of surplus at every time of the year, so that we can then bridge this gap. And then it makes things, you know, then research generally, just to be able to understand what are price trends, and how can we, you know, what are policy interventions, for instance. So a lot of countries, looking again from the context of Africa Continental Free Trade Agreements, go on, you know, to border closures and trade restriction policies, but just from a sheer point of lack of accurate and real-time data on what is our volume in reserve, what is available, and how many months cover of food do we have as a country. So yes, we need to, and API, the age of APIs, the age of open banking, financial inclusion, all of this supports shared data platforms. And I would encourage us to really think through these lines. And we are open. I would also implore the private and public sector players to start thinking collaboration. So I put my vote of confidence on collaboration and data.
Great, thank you very much for the reflections. Emmanuel, I'm going to shift slightly. We're getting a few comments, which I think are, some of them are quite provocative, so hopefully we'll have some good reflections here. Two that came up. One is, how relevant is the Continental Free Trade Agreement to food security? Or, is it possible that it's a ruse by developed countries to potentially distract us from, this question about competition, when really, there's maybe not the potential for competition. So would love your reflections on that question. And then another question, perhaps also on the, is this going to work or is it worth it side? Somebody who's a poultry farmer specifically said, when the borders were open, their business suffered. But when the borders were closed, they saw positive results. And what's the guarantee that the same won't happen when the free trade agreements sort of come into being? So I think some concern or question about, is it really relevant? Is it not just to distract us from, other things that we need to focus on? And my business has been directly impacted by the free trade, by, opened or closed borders. How will it be impacted sort of going forward?
Yeah, first, the poultry issue. Before the border was closed, there was a ban by law of a ban on the importation of poultry products. But our system, the corrupt system, allowed them in. Remember I said earlier, we can go into the free trade zone, but the free trade zone arrangement does not guarantee other countries will come and rearrange or reorganize our own customs. If there is dishonesty within it, so it must come from inside us. We might therefore say that because there are the corrupt policemen, thieves should be allowed to continue to operate. The point I'm trying to make here is this, that for the poultry industry, they have an opportunity now to ensure that those terms and conditions are put in the agreement that is yet to be signed that will protect them from this. So they don't sit back and allow other people to do it. That's the opportunity they have. And Nigeria Agribusiness Group is already working with the Poultry Association of Nigeria, PAN, on this. And if the gentleman too wants to get his association to get some ideas to them, it will be very good. So as for whether we should join the free trade zone, I assure you we cannot keep away from the world. Starts worse still from our own Black African brothers and sisters. We cannot, it does not make sense. If you say that we will not join, we will be outside it. It will not be easier for them to smuggle goods into Nigeria. And it's not difficult. You know how porous our borders are. Let us be realistic. It's true to say, Nigeria is a big market, but a big market that will not produce enough for itself. But one thing I also know is that the moment you see competition, you see Nigerians going to these other countries that have comparative advantage in production and start producing in those countries. If they have to import it into Nigeria, they will do so. Nigerians can never take last. I am confident about that. And that's the reason why that God-given opportunity we have, the youthfulness, the very well-educated people we have, and our determination everywhere to succeed will put us in a good stead. I have no fear at all. The Poultry Association, please, you will survive and you will do a lot better, but make sure that you are part of this discussion and negotiation of what is going to be signed. Thank you.
Great. I think that's a very, very good note to end on. I think I will give a quick opportunity for the other panelists. Any final reflections? I know we're coming up on time and we don't want to hold people for too long. Any final reflections in terms of our path towards the Continental Free Trade Agreement?
I think if I may start, I think one of the key things people need to learn and take away from this whole discussion around the Continental Free Trade Agreement is that historically Africa did more business with itself until when colonialism came into the picture, right? Most of the trade was between landlocked countries. You talk about trade from parts of Borno, Sokoto, all the way up to Sudan and the Great Malian Empire as it was known then. And I think that pursuing the objective of the Continental Free Trade Agreement is really about restoring order on the continent as it should be, if you permit me to look at it from a more poetic standpoint. But what is important now going forward into the future is that I think every country, and including Nigeria, we do have a right to protect our interests, protect our industries, and definitely protect our citizens. And so due consideration should be given to those vulnerable sectors, as it were. And the whole thing, the basis of the whole Continental Free Trade Agreement is anchored on fairness and trust, right? So what is fair? And the concept of the country of origin. I don't think proponents of the agreement are saying that African countries should not produce or be competitive between themselves. I guess the question there would be, we do not want that unfair advantage given to European countries who would, or American companies or Asian companies that would be passing off as Africa, whereas they're producing goods on other continents and bringing them and shipping them into our local markets. And I think if that is the case, then yes, government has a right to adopt protective measures or put in place quantitative or qualitative measures that might seem to impede, that would aim at stopping that trend. But largely speaking, the Continental Free Trade Agreement is really a good thing. It's something that we should embrace, and if anything, it should drive competitiveness. It should drive Nigerian companies, right, to really aim to produce at much higher levels, aim to be more competitive in their practices, and basically I think that's the way to go in the future. That's the way to go.
Great, thank you very much. Folusho, any final reflections on the path forward in terms of the agreement?
Yes, I wish the lobby group success. I pray everything happens in favor of the final signing of the agreement. But a point that I want to stress is that Nigeria must not miss the low-hanging fruits. And this is the time to take a look at the border towns. This is the time to assess the facilities at those border towns, to find out gaps that need to be filled so that we are well positioned. Nigeria is bordered in the south-south by Cameroon, southwest by Benin Republic, and northeast by Chad and Niger. So we should look at the towns that are in these border towns and do a quick assessment of what needs to be in place, what opportunities we can tap, because the people at the gateway of any country are the gatekeepers, and there are opportunities for trade that need to be put in place in those border towns. So I'm just saying, let's take a look at those areas and see how we can position ourselves so that other countries that may come in will not seize the opportunities there if we are not innovative enough.
Thank you. Ayodej?
Yeah. For me, you know, the last generation of Africans gave us independence. It's our responsibility to give the next generation a free trade economy. That's my pattern words.
Thank you. Final reflections, Emmanuel from NABG.
Speaker took the words from my mouth, and God bless him. Yes, forefathers gave us a great country, we have messed it up a bit. Let us take this opportunity to give our own children and children's children a better country. This is the time, and let us be determined to work together. God has been kind to us. We have the opportunity. We will make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will say, just on reflection, there are a few areas that came up throughout the conversation, which I think will be important as we think about the Institute of Directors and NABG's conversations around the Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think one is really this question about the subnational, and so this goes to Folusho's comment about who are the gatekeepers and how do we really understand the subnational competitiveness and how they'll be able to play a role in the free trade agreement. I think the other one which came out quite strongly is this question about which value chains, how open should we be, what are the stages to actually get there, but how do we take a strategic approach to the Continental Free Trade Agreement and ensure that we are still supporting our SMEs and farmers at the same time as ensuring a better future, which is likely moving towards free trade. And then I think the final one which came up, which is more came up in the Q&A, is really around what's going to be required from the government in terms of investments in infrastructure, whether that's road or rail or security or in terms of electricity, to ensure that we continue to be competitive, not just based on the potential and by the land and sort of the hard work of our people, but really from a more global perspective, how can we be competitive as we move forward into the Continental Free Trade Agreement? So I do want to say thank you to the different questions that came from the audience. I think we had quite an engaged audience, even though we have this sort of webinar format. And a very big thank you to the panelists, as well as to the Institute of Directors and the entire team for really setting up this conversation. I'll hand it back over to the chair, who can close us out and say some final remarks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nneka, for moderating this very important webinar addressing the whole issue of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Like we said, COVID is here, we'll get past it. The whole idea is, how do we remain competitive? How do we grow our economy? How do we now ensure that we have a more competitive country post-oil? One thing is for sure, we all know agriculture will play a very major role. So I think it's really on behalf of the Institute of Directors that I must thank our moderator for doing a wonderful job. And in particular, thank all our panelists for being there for us and contributing to this. For all our participants, I must thank you for joining in. And it's been quite interesting. I was following the Q&A, and it was quite an interesting chat going on there. So it's really to thank everyone for being part of this as chairman of the Agri Committee. I think any last words from IoD?
Mr. Chairman, sir, once again, I'd like to just thank you and thank you your committee for doing an excellent job. Of course, the panelists as well as the moderator simply been fantastic. I would like to mention the fact that at IoD, we decided that we would engage government in policy formulation as well as implementation. And we would welcome viewpoints from our members and indeed non-members as how to move that agenda forward. So please feel free, call in at IoD when you are free. We're back into business. Haven't just opened up offices in the last few days. So once again, until we'll meet up again at another webinar, which will be sponsoring possibly tomorrow, I think. There's one tomorrow and another on Friday. Thank you very much, and God bless all of you. Please keep safe and healthy during this first period. Thank you. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much. Have a very wonderful day.
I'll share mine.